In the year
Before it was too
1915,
late,
the world is
prepare
locked in the
yourselves.
horrors of World War I.
Friedrich shouted
The
to his
battlefront
men,
stretches
"We have
across
to end
Europe,
this now."
where men
The
are
enemy was
reduced
at
to
their door,
numbers in a
and the true
brutal
test had
conflict
begun.
that seems
The
to have no
cave
end.
wasn't just the
Amidst
room with
the
the
endless
stone.
trenches,
It was the
barbed
dark
wire,
heart of the
and
horror
mud,
they were
there is no
facing.
respite.
The point of no
Soldiers
return.
fight not only
There was
against
no
one
turning
another
back
but
now.
against the
To
endless
save their
cycle
world,
of
they would have
trauma
to
through
face the
death
true
and
source
despair
of
that
this
defines
plague.
the war.
And stop it,
Friedrich
or be
Adler, a
consumed
German
by it.
officer,
As
is
the
one
figure
such
raised his
soldier.
hand and
He
the
has
undead
fought in
closed
countless
in,
engagements on the
Friedrich felt
Eastern
the weight
Front.
of destiny
Each
upon
day
him.
is a struggle
The
to
final
hold
battle
on to
was
his
here,
humanity,
and this
even
time,
as the
it
war
would be
threatens
different.
to strip it
The
away.
source of evil
The
would
faces
fall.
of his
The
comrades,
figure
once
standing
full of
before
hope,
them,
are
the
now
twisted
hardened
puppet
by the
master,
violence they
raised his
endure.
hand with
Their
deliberate
eyes are hollow,
slowness.
their
A
spirits
pulse of dark
broken.
energy
The Eastern
radiated from
Front
his
is a
body,
place where battles
rippling
are
through
fought
the
in
air like a
isolated,
wave.
harsh
And Friedrich
landscapes,
felt a cold
in
chill
endless
grip his
trenches,
chest.
deep
His mind
forests,
raced
and
as the
desolate
undead
plains.
soldiers around
It
them
is here,
shifted into
near the
motion,
small fortress
their
of
eyes glowing
Osowiec,
with an
that
otherworldly
Friedrich
hunger.
finds himself
The stench of
stationed.
decay filled
The
the
fortress
chamber,
is a
more
symbol of
pungent
Russian
now,
strength,
as if the
a
very walls
fortified
themselves
hold
had
on the vast
absorbed the
expanse of
putrid
Eastern
essence of
Europe.
death.
Its massive
Friedrich's heart
walls,
pounded,
thick with
but
the
there was
echoes
no
of
time to
history,
second-guess.
serve as the
The
last
moment
line of
had
defense
arrived.
for the Russian
They had
Empire.
crossed the threshold
Against
into
the
this
German
nightmare.
advance,
There was no going
Friedrich
back
is no
now.
stranger to
To
the
fail
sounds of
here, to
artillery,
hesitate,
or the stench
would
of
mean
death.
not just their
He and
deaths,
his
but
unit
the
have fought for
total
every
collapse
inch of
of
ground.
everything they had fought
Yet even
for.
in this terrible
Wilhelm,
conflict,
Friedrich
he holds on
shouted
to
over
the
his
small
shoulder,
hope that the war
his
will
voice
soon be
cutting
over.
through the thick
His
silence.
thoughts often drift
Form a
back
line.
home to his wife,
Protect the
Emma,
doorway.
and their
The
young
sergeant,
daughter,
ever
Anna.
the stalwart
The
veteran,
letters he receives
quickly
from
barked
them are
orders.
his only
The
solace.
soldiers moved
He
into
dreams of a
position,
time when
their
the front
rifles
lines will
raised,
fade away,
but their
and
hands
he can
trembled.
return to the life
Every
he
man
once
in that
knew.
room could
But
feel
as the
it.
Battle of
This was
Osowiec
no
looms
ordinary
ever
battle.
closer,
This
the
was a
world
fight
as
for
Friedrich
survival
knows it
against
is
an
about to
ancient
change
force.
forever.
The puppet
Here,
master
in the heart
smiled
of the
coldly,
East,
his
something
lips
much
peeling back
darker
from
and
his
far more
teeth,
terrifying
which
is
were
about to
unnaturally
awaken,
sharp.
and his
Foolish
experience with the
Germans,
horrors
he
of war
spat, his
will
voice
no
oozing
longer
with
be
venom.
enough to prepare
Do you
him
think
for the
you can
nightmare
stop me?
ahead.
You
It was
cannot
early in the
defeat what
morning
you do
on
not
August 6,
understand. The dead are
1915,
mine.
when the
Their
first
will is
signs of
mine.
something truly
And soon,
unnatural
you will be
began.
just another
Friedrich
part of the
Adler stood atop a
army that
hill,
marches
peering
across
through
your
his
world.
field glasses,
The moment the
watching the
words left
distant
his
Russian
mouth,
positions
the
at
air seemed
Osowiec
to walk
fortress.
around them.
The fog
The
hung
undead
thick and
surged
obscured the
forward,
air,
their ragged
masking the
forms
horizon
crashing
in a
toward the
veil of
soldiers
ghostly
like a
white.
wave of decay.
It was the
They
calm
were
before the
faster
storm,
now,
a
stronger,
quiet respite
reacting
before
not
the
just to the
artillery
instinct of
bombardment would
hunger, but
commence.
to
He
the
had done this
malevolent will
100
of their
times
master.
before,
Fire.
preparing for an assault.
Friedrich barked.
But this
His
time,
voice a
something
crack of
felt
command
different.
that rang through
The
the
Russian
chamber.
lines had
His
been
rifle
battered for
kicked
days
back in his hands
by
as he
relentless
fired.
German
But
artillery.
the undead didn't
Their
fall as
defenses
they should
weakened
have.
and their
The
morale
bullets
shattered.
tore through their
Yet,
bodies,
as
but they were
Friedrich
not
scanned the
halted.
fortress through
They
his
staggered,
binoculars,
yes,
he
but
saw
they
no
kept
sign
coming.
of retreat.
Even the headshots
The Russian
that had been
soldiers
so reliable
remained,
in the past
their
were
positions
ineffective.
unmoving.
The creatures
A strange
weren't just
stillness
flesh and
had
bone
descended
anymore.
upon the
They were
battlefield.
vessels of pure
Then,
rage,
the
bound to
artillery
something
began to
darker.
roar. The
Wilhelm
ground
let out a
trembled
curse
beneath
as
Friedrich's
a zombie lunged
boots
for him.
as the
He
shells
barely
rained
dodged,
down on the
but
Russian
the thing was on him in
positions.
an instant.
But even as the
soldier's
explosions shook
rifle
the
went
earth,
flying,
there was
and
no
the undead's
discernible
rotting
effect.
hands closed
The
around his
Russians
neck.
did not scatter.
With a shout,
They did not fall
Wilhelm
back.
pulled his bayonet
In
hand,
fact,
drove
something
it into
far
the
worse
creature's
happened.
skull.
From the
The force of the
smouldering
strike
wreckage of
sending
their
a sickening
trenches,
crunch through the
Russian
room.
soldiers
But
began
as the
to
creature
rise,
collapsed,
slowly,
others were already moving
deliberately,
in,
as if the blast
driven
had
by
not
the
touched
unholy
them.
force
Their
that bound
uniforms were torn
Wilhelm,
and tattered,
Müller
their
screamed,
faces streaked
but
with
he was
dirt and
immediately
blood.
knocked off
But
his
it wasn't
feet by
just the
another wave of
destruction they'd
undead.
suffered that
The
caught
hissing
Friedrich's
breath of the
eye.
creatures
It was the
filling his
unnatural,
ears.
stiff
Friedrich's
movements,
eyes darted
the way
around
they
the room.
walked without
His
purpose or
soldiers were being
direction,
overwhelmed.
as if pulled
There
by
were
some
just too
unseen
many of them.
force.
The
And their
undead were
eyes,
everywhere,
wide and
pressing in
white
from
and
all
glassy,
sides,
void of
pushing them
life or
back
reason.
toward the stone
Friedrich
platform.
blinked,
The weight
certain
of the
his vision vision had deceived him. The fog seemed to swirl unnaturally around the battlefield, as these figures advanced toward the German lines, seemingly unaffected by the ongoing bombardment. The air was thick with an eerie silence, save for the faint sound of their guttural groans. It was then that the first shot rang out. A German soldier, one of Friedrich's men, unable to contain his fear, fired his rifle at one of the approaching Russian soldiers. The bullet struck the figure in the chest, but it didn't fall. The creature only staggered slightly, then continued its relentless march forward, as though it had felt no pain at all. A chill ran down Friedrich's spine. The terror that had been growing in his chest now spread like wildfire. This
What
was
the
no
hell do we
ordinary
do now?
attack. These
Friedrich's
were not
mind
soldiers
spun.
in retreat.
The undead weren't
These were
just
something
attacking.
else.
They were
Something
pulling them in,
wrong.
corralling
The
them
men
toward
around
the
him
dark
began to
figure in the
murmur in
center.
confusion and
Every
fear.
shot, every
Some clutched
movement
their
seemed to be
weapons,
feeding the
others
power of the
froze,
stone.
their minds
The puppet
struggling to
master's
grasp
power
what
was
they were
growing
seeing.
stronger,
Friedrich's
faster.
heart
The
pounded in
world
his
seemed
chest
to
as
close in around
the
him.
horror of what
The
he was
chamber,
witnessing
once
began to
vast and
settle in.
imposing, now
These
felt
weren't
like a
men.
tomb.
These were
The weight
dead
of
men walking.
inevitability pressed on his
Lieutenant
chest.
Adler.
It
A
felt
voice
as if
cut
the
through the
walls were
panic.
closing in on them.
It was one of his
The shadows
sergeants,
stretching
Wilhelm,
longer with
his
every
face
breath.
ashen.
They
What
were
in
in the
God's
heart of
name
the
are those
enemy's
things?
lair.
What
This was
do
the
we do?
moment that would either
Before
make or
Friedrich
break
could
them.
answer,
Then it
a
hit
shrill
him.
whistle cut
He
through the
remembered the
chaos.
symbols.
A messenger
glowing
arrived,
runes on the
breathless,
door. The
eyes
stone.
wide with terror.
The figure.
General von
It was all
Hindenburg
connected.
orders all
The
units
puppet
to
master wasn't
prepare
just
for
a
full
man.
engagement
He
with
was
the
a part
Russian
of this.
forces.
The stone, the
They are
energy,
not human
wasn't just
anymore.
for controlling
They
the
are.
undead.
They are
It was
something
feeding
else.
off of the living,
The messenger's
too.
voice cracked.
It wasn't just a
Friedrich's
weapon.
mind raced.
It was a trap.
The war had
We
just
have to
taken a
destroy the
turn into the
stone.
unimaginable.
Friedrich shouted,
The Russians,
his voice
his
piercing
enemies,
the chaos.
had become
But
something
how?
far more
Wilhelm cried
terrifying
out,
than mere
slamming
men.
his rifle
The
into a
undead were
zombie's
upon
head.
them.
It's
And as the
alive.
first
It's
wave
feeding
of
on
these
us.
gruesome,
Friedrich's
lifeless
eyes
soldiers
narrowed.
approached the
We
German
take away the
lines,
source of its
Friedrich
power.
understood
The
that the
man,
battle
the
for
stone,
Osowiec
it's all
fortress
linked.
was no
We
longer
have
one
to
of
sever that
soldiers.
link.
It was
The
one
puppet
for
master
survival.
raised his hand
The call
again,
had come,
his
whether
smile
Friedrich was
widening as he
ready or
sensed
not.
their realization.
He could hear the
You think
distant
you can
rumble
stop
of
me?
artillery,
His
but it
voice
was
dripped
drowned
with
out by
mockery.
the horrifying
You are already
groans
lost.
of the advancing
chamber
Russian
seemed to
zombies.
hum in response
The
to his
world he had
words.
known, of men and war, was now gone. The terror of what he faced was unimaginable. And yet, there was no turning back. The battlefield had changed. The enemy had changed. And Friedrich had no choice but to face it. Friedrich's pulse races as the Russian horde continues to advance. The battlefield, once a familiar and terrifying landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and artillery, had now become a surreal, nightmarish arena. The soldiers around him were frozen in disbelief, their rifles shaking in their hands as they stared at the approaching undead. There was no strategy for this. No playbook for facing creatures that should have been dead. "Lieutenant, what do we do?" Sergeant Wilhelm's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes wide with terror. The chaos of the moment was overwhelming. The undead Russian soldiers, their skin mottled with decay and their eyes lifeless, continued to shuffle forward, their movements stiff and unnatural. Some of them had entire limbs missing. Yet they advanced with unyielding determination, as though the very laws of biology had no power over them. Friedrich felt the weight of the situation press down on him, the instinct to flee, to run as fast as possible, gnawed at the edges of his mind. But he was a soldier, a leader. He had sworn an oath to protect his men and his country, and now that oath demanded he confront this unimaginable horror. He couldn't afford to hesitate, no matter how strange or terrifying the situation had become. But what were these creatures? Were they truly dead? The artillery had failed to stop them. The fear that crept up Friedrich's spine was not just a fear of the unknown, but of something far darker, a fear of the unnatural. A fear that what he was facing wasn't just an army, but something that defied all logic, all reason. A voice called out from behind him, sharp and commanding, cutting through the panic. "Adler!" Friedrich turned to see an officer, an aide from General von Hindenburg's staff, riding toward him at full gallop. His face was grim, but his eyes were set with the cold determination of a man who had seen worse. The horse kicked up dust as it slid to a halt in front of Friedrich. The officer dismounting quickly. "Lieutenant," the officer said, his voice tight with urgency, "General von Hindenburg has ordered all forces to engage. But you need to understand something. This is no ordinary assault. We believe these Russian soldiers have been altered. Something has turned them into these abominations. We don't know the cause yet, but it's not a chemical weapon. It's something far worse. Something we cannot fully comprehend." Friedrich's heart sank as the weight of the officer's words sank in. "Altered," he repeated, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "But how? Why?" The officer's eyes flickered toward the mass of advancing undead. A new weapon, perhaps. Or an ancient force. We don't have answers, Lieutenant. But we need to stop them. If this is allowed to spread, it could change the course of the war, or even the world entirely. The officer handed Friedrich a sealed envelope. The general's orders. You are to lead a small reconnaissance team into the heart of Osowiec fortress. Find out what's behind this. Destroy it if you can. The words hit Friedrich like a punch to the gut. Destroy it. As though it could be as simple as setting fire to a campfire. But Friedrich knew better. He knew there was no quick fix. No easy solution to a problem like this. They were facing something beyond the scope of any training, tactic or battle plan. And yet, here he was, standing at the crossroads of this new, horrific reality, tasked with finding a way to stop it. He took the envelope and nodded grimly, his mind already racing through the possibilities. His unit had lost its way in the fog of war long ago, but now it felt like the very fabric of the world itself had unraveled. There was no going back. There was only the next step. And that step was into the heart of the fortress. Into the unknown. Yes, sir, Friedrich said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling in his mind. The officer's expression softened for a moment. I know it's a lot to ask, Lieutenant. But the fate of this front, and perhaps the entire war, could hinge on what you find in there. Friedrich's gaze shifted to the Russian horde, still advancing like a wave of death. The morning light was fading, and with it, the last vestiges of his hope that this was all a terrible dream. There would be no peace. Not until the mystery of the undead was solved. He looked back at his men, still paralyzed with fear, and spoke with quiet authority. Gather the men, he ordered. We move out at once. As his soldiers snapped to attention, Friedrich felt the heavy burden of command settle upon him. He was no longer just a soldier on the front lines. He was now a man who had been thrust into the unknown, carrying not just the weight of his own survival, but the survival of everyone around him. With a final, lingering look at the Russian zombies approaching, Friedrich turned and led his team toward Osowiec fortress. The call had come. And now, he had no choice but to answer. As Friedrich marched toward the command tent, his mind raced with doubt. The terrible sight of the Russian zombies, those mindless, decaying husks that had once been men, still haunted him. The sheer unnaturalness of what he had witnessed felt, as though it were tearing at the very fabric of his understanding. His years of military training, the endless drills and strategies he had memorized, none of it had prepared him for this. What was he being asked to do? He had faced battles before, and he had led men into the heart of enemy positions. But never had he been thrust into such a nightmare. The thought of entering Osowiec fortress, the very epicenter of the horror, made his stomach churn. And now, to uncover whatever foul force had turned the Russian soldiers into these things. The more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. How could one man, or even a small team of soldiers, fight against what felt like a curse, a plague? These were not mere men they were facing. They were something else, something beyond the laws of nature. The very idea of confronting it filled Friedrich with a deep, gnawing fear. He reached the edge of the trench, where his men were gathered. Most of them were silent, their faces pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Some were trying to calm their shaking hands. Others whispered prayers to God, though they seemed unsure of what they were praying for. Sergeant Wilhelm caught his eye. He opened his mouth as if to say something but then closed it again. No words could capture the horror that had descended upon them all. The men were no longer just soldiers, they were survivors, clinging to a thin thread of hope in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Lieutenant, Wilhelm said finally, his voice low and hesitant. We can't go in there. We can't fight. That. Friedrich stopped in his tracks. The words pierced through him like a cold, heavy stone. We've seen the Russian lines. Wilhelm continued, his gaze turning toward the approaching undead soldiers, still shuffling mindlessly forward. They're not men anymore. They're dead. We're not trained for this. No one is. We'll just be walking into a massacre. The thought echoed in Friedrich's mind. The fear that the others were beginning to express. The doubt and uncertainty. It had always been there, deep inside him. But now it was breaking through the surface. He didn't want to lead his men into a trap. Into the jaws of something that was not even human. How could they possibly win? How could they face something so unnatural? He turned away from Wilhelm. His eyes scanning the sky as if searching for some divine answer. But all he saw was the same thick fog and the endless, implacable march of the undead. The fortress was still miles away, but it already felt like a world away. The messenger's words echoed in his mind. General von Hindenburg had trusted him with this task. But why? Why him? There were other officers, other men who could handle this. Maybe he wasn't the right one for this. Maybe he should let someone else, someone braver, take the lead. If I go in there, if I lead my men in there, it could be the end for all of us. The thought gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if they couldn't destroy the source of this curse? What if, in the end, the only thing that awaited them was a slow, painful death? Just like the Russian soldiers who had been turned eye to these mindless creatures. Friedrich clenched his fists. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He had fought in the war for too long to turn back now. He had seen men fall in battle, had led soldiers into certain death before, but this was different. It was as if the very laws of nature had broken, as though they were not fighting an army, but some evil force that existed beyond human understanding. And it was overwhelming him. The fear was suffocating. He turned to face his men, his comrades, his brothers in arms. They were waiting, looking to him for guidance. But he had none to offer. He swallowed hard. "We don't know what we're facing," he muttered. More to himself than to anyone else. "These aren't men anymore, but things. And we have no idea how to stop them." The men nodded, murmuring in agreement. But their faces spoke a different language. The terror in their eyes was clear. They were afraid to die. But they were even more afraid of what would happen if they didn't act. They had been trained for war, for combat. But no one had prepared them for this. No one had prepared them for the walking dead. Wilhelm stepped forward, his expression grim. "Sir, you've led us through every battle, every assault. But this is different. We're not just fighting soldiers anymore. We're fighting ghosts, or demons, or some kind of disease we don't understand. If we march into that fortress, it's like we're marching to our own graves." Friedrich could feel his resolve starting to waver. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to refuse this impossible mission, to save his men from certain death. What if he led them into the heart of Osowiec, and they were never seen again? What if this mission was doomed from the start, and they were only walking into a slaughterhouse? His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, commanding voice behind him. "Lieutenant Adler." Friedrich turned, his heart pounding in his chest. General von Hindenburg stood in the shadows, his face illuminated by the dim light filtering through the fog. The general's presence was a sharp contrast to the fear that had settled over the soldiers. "I know what you are thinking, Friedrich," von Hindenburg said, his voice as steady and firm as always. "This is unlike anything you have faced before. I understand your hesitation. But you are the man chosen to do this. Not because you are fearless, but because you have the strength to face what others cannot. You will not be alone. You have your men. And you have the will to succeed, even in the darkest moments. This is your moment to lead." Friedrich's mind spun with uncertainty, but as the general's words settled in, something stirred within him. The fear still gripped his chest, but the seed of duty and honor began to grow. He had always believed that soldiers did not run from battle, that the courage of a leader was measured not by the absence of fear, but by the will to push forward in spite of it. "But how can I know what to do?" Friedrich said, his voice hoarse with doubt. How can I lead when I don't even understand what we're fighting? Von Hindenburg's eyes softened, just for a moment. That is why we need you, Friedrich. To find the answer. You may not have all the answers now, but the mission remains the same. Stop this before it spreads. You are our best hope. The words echoed in Friedrich's mind as he looked back at his men, who were waiting for him to make a decision. The doubt still lingered, but something in him had shifted. The duty to his country, to his comrades, and to the men he commanded pulled him back from the brink of hesitation. He nodded slowly, as if to himself. We will go forward, he said, his voice firm. We have no choice. For the sake of all of us. And with that, the call was answered. The fear remained, but it no longer controlled him. The journey had begun, and though he didn't know where it would end, Friedrich Adler knew he had taken the first step. The refusal was over. The fog had thickened as the hours passed, clinging to the trees like a damp shroud. It seemed to close in around Friedrich and his men, as they made their way toward Osowiec fortress, the distant silhouette of its massive stone walls barely visible through the mist. The unnatural quiet of the battlefield weighed heavily on them. No birdsong, no distant artillery fire. Just the hollow shuffle of the undead Russian soldiers moving in the distance, their low moans cutting through the silence. Friedrich could hear the uneasy mutterings of his men behind him, the gnawing fear palpable in every step. Each of them had their own thoughts, their own doubts. But they remained silent, marching forward in grim determination. They trusted him to lead them through this nightmare, even though none of them could truly understand what they were about to face. As they neared the outer defenses of Osowiec, the team halted, taking cover behind a thick copse of trees. The fortress loomed ahead, an imposing fortress of stone and iron. But now, it felt more like a tomb, a place of death rather than defense. Friedrich paused, his gaze flicking over the terrain. His mind was still clouded with questions. How had the Russian forces been transformed into these zombies? What was the nature of the weapon, or curse, that had turned them into these shambling horrors? He had no answers, only the growing certainty that something was amiss. There was something far darker at play here than anyone had anticipated. Then, out of the fog, a figure approached. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the thick mist. But as it drew closer, Friedrich's heart skipped a beat. The man who emerged from the mist was tall, with a commanding presence that seemed to part the fog around him. His uniform was unlike any other Friedrich had seen on the front lines. Dark, decorated with numerous medals, and almost too immaculate for the conditions of war. His face was weathered but sharp, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. General von Hindenburg? Friedrich asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. The general nodded. Indeed. I came to offer guidance. We've spoken before, but now, it is time for you to hear what I have not said aloud. Friedrich felt the tension ease slightly in his shoulders, but the weight of the situation did not lessen. He had expected to face this battle alone, but here was von Hindenburg, appearing in the mist as though summoned by fate itself. The very man who had sent him on this mission. Now, here to ensure that it would not be his last. General, Friedrich said, voice firm despite the gnawing uncertainty. I've been thinking on what you said. I'm still not certain I understand what we're facing. These soldiers. They're dead, yet alive. The Russians didn't just fight us, they became something else. What do we do? Von Hindenburg studied him for a moment. The weight of his gaze intense, then took a slow step forward. The enemy you face is not merely the Russian army. It is an abomination, a force that should never have been unleashed. But it is. And now, you are tasked with ending it. I know this is beyond your training, but you have something that no one else does. A mind sharp enough to think beyond the battlefield. Friedrich's brow furrowed. I don't understand. What do you mean, General? Von Hindenburg sighed deeply, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. What you are facing, Lieutenant, is not just an army of the dead. It is a weapon, a curse, perhaps. created from the very chemicals we have used in this war. The Russians have unleashed something far darker than poison gas. This plague, if you will, is a weapon designed to defy death itself. Friedrich's blood ran cold. A chemical weapon that raises the dead. You've seen it. I have, von Hindenburg replied. In truth, I did not want to send you here alone. But I am forced to act from afar, coordinating the larger efforts to ensure the rest of the war does not fall apart. Your task is not just to find the source but to destroy it. You cannot fight these things with the usual tactics. Firearms, grenades, even bayonets. The dead do not feel pain. They do not retreat. What you must do is find the source of this plague. The core of this unnatural transformation. The center of its power. Friedrich's mind was reeling, trying to process what von Hindenburg was saying. A weapon that brings the dead back to life. A curse created from chemicals designed to ravage the living? But how? Friedrich asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts. How do we stop something like that? How do we fight something we don't even understand? Von Hindenburg stepped closer, his expression growing even more intense. You will need more than just strength and skill to defeat this, Lieutenant. You will need courage, resourcefulness, and a will to survive even in the face of the impossible. Trust your instincts. Trust your men. And remember this, you must destroy the source. Whatever it is, you cannot allow it to spread. The general paused, the weight of his words sinking in. The enemy you face is not a conventional one. You will need to adapt. Think outside the box. The undead are not invincible. They are simply a tool. Find the heart of this infection, and sever it. Friedrich nodded slowly, feeling the full force of the mission weighing down on him. It seemed impossible. It felt like a task too great for any one man, too overwhelming for any small group of soldiers. But he could see the determination in von Hindenburg's eyes. The same steel resolve that had carried the general through countless battles. It was a kind of faith that Friedrich had seen in men who had survived unspeakable odds. Perhaps that was the key, faith. Faith in the mission. Faith in the men he led. Faith that, despite the odds, he could find a way to stop the undead horde. There is one more thing you must know, von Hindenburg added, his voice lowering. The Russians have a new weapon. One that is tied to the source of the plague. It is located in the deepest parts of the fortress. The chemical compound, whatever it is, must be destroyed. If you fail, the undead will not only overrun your lines, they will spread. The Russian forces, those still alive, will be unable to contain it. The rest of Europe will fall into chaos. Friedrich's pulse quickened, but his resolve firmed. The path was now clear. He had a purpose, a mission. To stop the plague before it could spread further. To destroy whatever twisted force had raised the dead from their graves. I understand, Friedrich said, his voice steady once more. A new determination settling into his chest. We will find the source and end it, General. I won't fail you. Von Hindenburg nodded, his expression unreadable. I have no doubt, Lieutenant. But remember, you will not be alone. The men you lead are more than soldiers. They are your allies in this fight. Trust them. And trust yourself. With that, the general turned and disappeared back into the mist. As silently as he had come, leaving Friedrich standing in the thick fog. Alone with his thoughts. But not without the quiet strength of purpose that would guide him. Through the coming storm. The mission had just begun. And now, with von Hindenburg's guidance, Friedrich knew the true weight of the task before him. The real battle was not just against the Russian zombies. It was against a force that defied nature itself. But there was no turning back. The journey would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. He turned to his men, his voice cutting through the mist. Gather your courage, gentlemen. We move forward. The mist hung heavy in the air as Friedrich and his small team approached. The towering stone walls of Osowiec fortress. It loomed before them like a forgotten monument to a bygone era. Its high battlements and weathered gates. Now a grim reminder of the horrors that lay inside. The world outside the fortress had already descended into chaos. The unnatural army of Russian zombies was advancing, their dead eyes empty and relentless. But here, at the gates of Osowiec, was where the true heart of the nightmare beat. This was where the plague had begun, and where it must be stopped. Friedrich felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, as his soldiers lined up behind him. They had all been through the horrors of war before. Bombs, gas, artillery barrages. But this was different. This was beyond the realm of conventional conflict. This was a fight against something that should not exist. The gates of Osowiec were still standing, but they seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as though the fortress itself had become corrupted by the unnatural forces at work. The quiet had settled in like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the distant groans of the undead, and the occasional creepy rustle of the trees. No birds, no animals, no sound of life. Only the dead. "Are we ready, Lieutenant?" Sergeant Wilhelm's voice broke through Friedrich's thoughts, a hint of fear still lurking beneath his words. Friedrich turned to face his men. They were all there. Wilhelm, the sharp-eyed veteran who had stood by his side through the worst of the war. Young Corporal Müller, whose pale face betrayed his nerves but also his courage. And the rest of the squad. Each man showing varying degrees of fear, but none showing weakness. They were ready to follow him into this unknown nightmare, no matter how deep the darkness. "Once we cross these gates," Friedrich said, his voice steady but low, "there's no turning back. We don't know what we're facing inside, but we know one thing, it ends here. We either find the source of this plague and destroy it, or we die trying." There was a moment of silence, but it was not one of doubt. It was a moment of understanding. Each man had already accepted the consequences of their actions. The world outside the gates was already lost to them. The only chance they had was to push forward, to face the heart of the horror, and to strike before it could spread any further. With a deep breath, Friedrich stepped forward, his hand resting on the cold, iron handle of the gate. The fortress seemed to watch them as he pushed the doors open. The groan of rusted hinges is the only sound in the thick silence. A heavy, damp scent rose from within, the unmistakable smell of decay and rot. It was like the fortress itself was alive. Alive with something unnatural. Something far darker than the human enemy they had fought for years. The first step inside felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The air was thick, stagnant, almost suffocating. The walls were lined with ancient stone, their surfaces slick with moisture, and the faint echoes of distant footfalls reverberating could be heard deep in the shadows of long corridors. "We move carefully," Friedrich ordered, his voice a whisper now, as though speaking too loudly would somehow disturb the very air around them. "Stay in formation. Watch each other's backs. And don't let your guard down. These things, they could be anywhere." They advanced cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the layers of dust and grime that covered the floor. The further they went, the more the atmosphere shifted. The walls seemed to close in on them, and strange sounds echoed through the hallways. Groans, whispers, and the soft shuffle of footsteps that didn't belong to them. It felt as though the fortress itself was alive, watching them, waiting. Friedrich's heart beat faster with every step. He had crossed the threshold, leaving behind the relative certainty of the battlefield for the unknown. They were no longer fighting a conventional war. They were stepping into a place where science, logic, and the laws of nature had broken down completely. There was no rulebook for this. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, soft at first, then louder. The unmistakable rasp of a dead breath, followed by a guttural growl. The hairs on the back of Friedrich's neck stood up. "Get ready," he hissed. In an instant, the soldiers fanned out, rifles raised. The shadows in the corridor ahead seemed to shift. And then, like a wave breaking against a rock, figures emerged from the darkness. Russian soldiers, no, not soldiers anymore, shambled forward, their faces a grotesque mockery of life. The same vacant, glassy eyes. The same ragged uniforms. But now, their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Like marionettes with their strings cut. Friedrich fired first, his rifle's crack breaking the tension like a thunderclap. The shot hit one of the zombies square in the chest, but the creature didn't fall. It staggered, unperturbed, and continued its relentless march forward. The others followed, their bodies lurching toward the soldiers. "Watch your fire," Friedrich shouted. "Aim for the head. The heart won't stop them." A chaotic firefight erupted in the narrow corridor as the soldiers opened fire. Bullets flew, but each shot that didn't land in the right place seemed to have no effect. The undead soldiers kept coming. Their bodies impervious to the pain, their hunger insatiable. It felt like the world was closing in on them as the creatures pressed forward. Their guttural moans rising to an almost deafening pitch. Friedrich fought to keep his focus. His heart pounding, his mind screaming for answers. Why weren't they dying? What was it that had turned these men into this? "Keep firing," Wilhelm barked. His voice strained as he gunned down another of the undead. "We can't let them surround us." Friedrich nodded, but deep inside, the nagging question kept echoing. What had happened to them? What had turned these men into monsters? And where was the source of this plague? But there was no time for answers now. They were through the threshold. The fortress was their battleground, and they had to fight their way through it, one step at a time. The dead were all around them, but they were not alone. The fortress, with all its secrets, was waiting. "Stay focused," Friedrich shouted. "We move forward. We find the source. And we end this." With that, they pushed forward, into the heart of the fortress. Leaving behind the last vestiges of the known world. The unknown was ahead, and nothing would stop them from finding it. The threshold had been crossed. The true journey had begun. The silence that followed the initial gunfire was eerie. The last of the Russian zombies collapsed to the floor with an unnatural thud. Its decaying body stiff and lifeless once more. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. But the battle was far from over. Friedrich's heart was still pounding in his chest. His rifle warm in his hands. He didn't take his eyes off the still bodies scattered around the corridor. The men, too, stood tense, eyes darting back and forth, waiting for the next attack. "Wilhelm," Friedrich muttered, his voice low but firm. "How much further?" Sergeant Wilhelm wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "We've cleared a bit of ground, but it's hard to tell. This place is a maze. We'll need to move fast if we're going to reach the core of this thing. We can't afford to stay in one place too long." Friedrich nodded. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on them. The longer they stayed here, the more likely the undead would find them. The fortress seemed alive with the echo of their presence. And it wasn't just the zombies. Something in the air, the thick, heavy energy, suggested that the true horror was deeper within. "All right," Friedrich said. "We move in pairs. Keep your weapons ready and don't let your guard down. Stay sharp. And don't forget, headshots only." The men nodded, falling into formation as they continued down the dark, winding corridor. The flickering glow from their lanterns cast eerie shadows on the stone walls, stretching and distorting as they moved forward. The further they went, the more unsettling the fortress became. They passed rooms filled with abandoned equipment, empty bunk beds, and broken crates. Everything had been left behind in haste, but there was no sign of life. At least, not human life. The sense of abandonment was suffocating. The only movement now was the slow shuffling of their boots on the dust-covered floor, broken only by the occasional sound of distant, muffled moans. Suddenly, the corridor they were in opened up into a large chamber. It was cold, the air musty with age. At the far end of the room stood an imposing iron door, its surface covered in strange symbols that Friedrich didn't recognize. They were carved into the metal with a precision that made his skin crawl. The symbols felt ancient, almost like something that didn't belong in this time. Like something from an era long past. "What in God's name is that?" Muller whispered, his voice trembling as he pointed at the door. Friedrich's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. He could feel it, the oppressive presence of something far darker on the other side. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "We'll need to move carefully," Friedrich said. "We don't know what's waiting behind that door. Stay alert." They moved forward slowly, checking every corner, every shadow. But before they could reach the door, a loud, shuffling sound came from behind them. A low growl echoed in the chamber, sending a wave of dread through Friedrich's chest. "Enemies," Wilhelm muttered, his hand tightening on his rifle. Turning, Friedrich saw them, more undead soldiers. But these were different from the ones they had already encountered. These were not the decayed, slow-moving husks they had been fighting. These were stronger, faster, and they seemed more focused, their movements more coordinated, like they were being controlled by some unseen force. The first of them lunged at Müller, who barely managed to sidestep in time. The creature's teeth snapped just inches from his face, and it crashed into the stone wall with a sickening thud. The others were closing in fast, moving as one, drawn to the scent of living flesh. "Form up!" Friedrich shouted, as he and Wilhelm opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the walls and the undead soldiers. But none of the shots seemed to slow them down. Friedrich's mind raced. This was different. This was no longer just a matter of survival, it was a battle of wills. Whoever or whatever was controlling these creatures was adapting, evolving. They weren't just mindless zombies anymore, they were soldiers, with a purpose. "Headshots! Keep them back!" Wilhelm shouted, his voice strained. Friedrich fired again, this time hitting one of the creatures square in the forehead. It collapsed, lifeless, but there was no time to celebrate. They kept coming. "We need to get to that door," Friedrich barked, grabbing Müller by the arm and pulling him toward the iron door. The others followed quickly, firing as they went. But the zombies were relentless. They reached the door, but it was locked. The strange symbols on its surface glowing faintly now, as if responding to their presence. "We need to open this now," Wilhelm yelled, slamming his fist against the door. "It's the only way out." Friedrich glanced at the symbols. They pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, as though they were alive, reacting to the sound of the fighting. There was something strangely familiar about them, like they were connected to the very plague that had infected the Russians. Müller's voice broke through his thoughts. "Lieutenant, what now?" Friedrich's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might give them a clue. The zombies were closing in. The feeling of being trapped began to settle over him like a suffocating weight. And then, as if on instinct, he stepped forward and pressed his hand against the door. The symbols flickered, and for a brief moment, he felt a jolt of energy run through him. A pulse, almost like a warning. Suddenly, there was a low, grinding sound. The door began to shift, slowly opening, revealing what lay beyond. "Quick, inside!" Friedrich shouted, pushing Müller and the others through the door. Just as the first of the undead reached them, they filed into the room, which was much larger than they had anticipated. The walls were lined with strange machinery, unlike anything they had ever seen before. Pipes snaked through the ceiling, and strange glass vials, filled with glowing, viscous liquid, lined the shelves. A central platform stood in the middle of the room, with a large, dark stone at its center. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals. Something metallic, something sharp. Friedrich moved cautiously into the room, his hand gripping his rifle tightly. As he approached the platform, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound of undead growls muffled but still unmistakable. "This is it," Friedrich muttered under his breath, looking at the stone. There was something wrong about it. It wasn't just an object, it felt like a focal point. An anchor for whatever force had corrupted the Russian soldiers, turning them into these grotesque, mindless creatures. "We're close," he said, looking to his men. "But we need to destroy whatever this is. Now." A low hiss filled the room, and for the briefest of moments, Friedrich thought he saw shadows moving in the corners of the chamber. Figures lurking, watching. They weren't alone. The true enemy was closer than they thought. The air in the chamber was heavy, thick with the scent of chemicals. And something more unsettling: decay. The strange symbols on the door flickered faintly in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe across the walls. The central platform with the dark stone was still, but it loomed in the middle of the room like a silent, ominous sentinel, a reminder that the source of the plague, the heart of the horror, lay just beyond their grasp. Friedrich's pulse raced. He could feel it now. This was no longer just a battle of survival. This was the moment where everything would change. They had come this far, deeper into the fortress, than any man should have gone. But they were not prepared for what they would find. The silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. "We need to destroy whatever's powering this," Wilhelm whispered, his voice tight. "Whatever it is, it's controlling the dead. This stone. It's like some kind of focus. We've seen things like this before in the war, but never this." The others nodded, their faces pale under the flickering light. Muller's hand trembled as he gripped his rifle, his eyes scanning the room for movement. They had crossed into enemy territory now, not just a physical place, but a place where the laws of nature seemed to have broken down entirely. Friedrich stepped cautiously toward the platform. It was hard to keep his thoughts straight. Everything inside him screamed to move faster, to end this nightmare before it spread. But there was something wrong about this place. The very air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, like a storm waiting to break. The stone at the center of the platform was black, smooth, almost liquid in its sheen. It pulsed with a faint, sickly light, like the beating heart of the fortress itself. As Friedrich approached, he could feel an almost magnetic pull drawing him closer, as if the stone were calling to him. "We should be careful," Muller said, his voice shaking. "We don't know what that thing is." Friedrich nodded, his gaze fixed on the stone. "I know. But it's the source. We can't leave here without destroying it. We came this far. We have to finish it." As he reached the platform, he placed a tentative hand on the stone. The moment his fingers touched it, the entire room seemed to shudder. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the pulsing light from the stone grew more intense, faster, more erratic. A low hum filled the room, and suddenly, the air around them seemed to ripple. The floor beneath them vibrated as though something large was moving deep beneath the fortress. Something ancient, something alive. The stone began to crack, spiderwebbing across its surface, revealing a swirling, dark energy within. It was like staring into the abyss itself, deep, black, and full of malice. Friedrich stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. "It's not just a weapon," he whispered, his voice a mix of awe and terror. "It's a curse. A power. Something that shouldn't exist. Then we need to destroy it now," Wilhelm urged, stepping forward with his rifle raised. "Whatever it is, we can't let it spread any further." Friedrich shook his head. "It's not that simple. This is more than just a weapon. It's controlling the dead. It's controlling everything. It is the source." Suddenly, the crackling hum of the stone reached a deafening pitch, and the air seemed to explode with energy. Friedrich's eyes widened as the stone's surface began to shift, the cracks widening as if something was pushing outward from inside. The stone was alive. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. Friedrich's breath caught in his throat as dark shapes began to coalesce at the edges of the chamber. They were humanoid figures, their forms rising from the shadows, as if pulled from the very walls themselves. The figures moved forward, emerging slowly, their faces shrouded in darkness. As they stepped into the light, Friedrich's blood ran cold. They were dead, but not like the soldiers they had fought before. These were different. Their skin was dark, cracked, and wrinkled, their eyes glowing with an unnatural, sickly light. Their movements were slow at first, but their power was palpable. And then Friedrich saw it. In the midst of the shadows, at the heart of the room, stood a figure. A man, but not quite a man. Tall, pale, and gaunt, his eyes burning with a cold, feral light. He wore a tattered Russian military uniform, but there was something wrong with him. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal. His skin stretched tight across his bones, and his lips pulled back into a cruel, twisted smile. The puppet master. The one controlling the undead. "I see you've made it this far," the man said in a voice that echoed in the room, low and mocking. "But you are too late. The plague is already spreading. Your efforts are futile. You will join them soon enough." The man stepped forward, and as he did, the undead around him began to stir. They weren't just soldiers. They were creatures, their bodies twisted and malformed, their eyes burning with unnatural hunger. They moved as one, their minds linked by whatever dark force controlled them. Friedrich's stomach turned. They had reached the heart of the plague, the very source of the infection. But now, the true enemy had shown itself. "You," Friedrich said, his voice shaking but determined. "You are the cause of all this. The curse, the plague. It was you." The figure smiled wider, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too unnatural. "Indeed. I am the architect of your suffering. The stone you see before you is the key to the resurrection. The dead are merely vessels. The real power lies in me." Friedrich's mind raced. The man before them was no ordinary soldier. This was something older, something darker. A warlock, or worse, an experiment gone wrong. Somehow, he had unlocked the secret of raising the dead, binding their souls to his will, creating this nightmare. The stone was a conduit. It wasn't just controlling the dead. It was powering this thing. It was the link between life and death. And this man had used it to turn the tide of war in his favor, at the cost of countless lives. And now, the very world would pay the price. Friedrich's eyes narrowed. They had to destroy the stone, and him, before it was too late. "Prepare yourselves," Friedrich shouted to his men. "We have to end this now." The enemy was at their door, and the true test had begun. The inmost cave wasn't just the room with the stone. It was the dark heart of the horror they were facing. The point of no return. There was no turning back now. To save their world, they would have to face the true source of this plague. And stop it, or be consumed by it. As the figure raised his hand and the undead closed in, Friedrich felt the weight of destiny upon him. The final battle was here. And this time, it would be different. The source of evil would fall. The figure standing before them, the twisted puppet master, raised his hand with deliberate slowness. A pulse of dark energy radiated from his body, rippling through the air like a wave. And Friedrich felt a cold chill grip his chest. His mind raced as the undead soldiers around them shifted into motion, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. The stench of decay filled the chamber, more pungent now, as if the very walls themselves had absorbed the putrid essence of death. Friedrich's heart pounded, but there was no time to second guess. The moment had arrived. They had crossed the threshold into this nightmare. There was no going back now. To fail here, to hesitate, would mean not just their deaths but the total collapse of everything they had fought for. "Wilhelm!" Friedrich shouted over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Form a line. Protect the doorway." The sergeant, ever the stalwart veteran, quickly barked orders. The soldiers moved into position, their rifles raised. But their hands trembled. Every man in that room could feel it. This was no ordinary battle. This was a fight for survival against an ancient force. The puppet master smiled coldly, his lips peeling back from his teeth, which were unnaturally sharp. "Foolish Germans," he spat, his voice oozing with venom. "Do you think you can stop me? You cannot defeat what you do not understand. The dead are mine. Their will is mine. And soon, you will be just another part of the army that marches across your world." The moment the words left his mouth, the air seemed to warp around them. The undead surged forward, their ragged forms crashing toward the soldiers like a wave of decay. They were faster now, stronger, reacting not just to the instinct of hunger but to the malevolent will of their master. "Fire!" Friedrich barked. his voice a crack of command that rang through the chamber. His rifle kicked back in his hands as he fired. But the undead didn't fall as they should have. The bullets tore through their bodies, but they were not halted. They staggered, yes, but they kept coming. Even the headshots that had been so reliable in the past were ineffective. The creatures weren't just flesh and bone anymore. They were vessels of pure rage, bound to something darker. Wilhelm let out a curse as a zombie lunged for him. He barely dodged, but the thing was on him in an instant. The soldier's rifle went flying, and the undead's rotting hands closed around his neck. With a shout, Wilhelm pulled his bayonet and drove it into the creature's skull. The force of the strike sending a sickening crunch through the room. But as the creature collapsed, others were already moving in, driven by the unholy force that bound them. Wilhelm! Muller screamed. But he was immediately knocked off his feet by another wave of undead, the hissing breath of the creatures filling his ears. Friedrich's eyes darted around the room. His soldiers were being overwhelmed. There were just too many of them. The undead were everywhere, pressing in from all sides, pushing them back toward the stone platform. The weight of the situation hit Friedrich like a hammer. His men were dying. He fired again, and again, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Each shot landed, but each creature was harder to kill. It was as if the darkness had infused their bodies, made them unkillable, almost supernatural in their resilience. "Focus on the puppet master," Friedrich shouted, aiming his rifle at the figure in the center of the room. But before he could pull the trigger, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. The stone on the platform pulsed again, and with it, the undead surged forward like a tidal wave, forcing Friedrich and his men to stumble backward. Muller, struggling to his feet, yelled, "We can't just shoot our way out of this. What the hell do we do now?" Friedrich's mind spun. The undead weren't just attacking. They were pulling them in, corralling them toward the dark figure in the center. Every shot, every movement seemed to be feeding the power of the stone. The puppet master's power was growing stronger, faster. The world seemed to close in around him. The chamber, once vast and imposing, now felt like a tomb. The weight of inevitability pressed on his chest. It felt as if the walls were closing in on them, the shadows stretching longer with every breath. They were in the heart of the enemy's lair. This was the moment that would either make or break them. Then it hit him. He remembered the symbols. The glowing runes on the door. The stone. The figure. It was all connected. The puppet master wasn't just a man. He was a part of this. The stone, the energy, wasn't just for controlling the undead. It was feeding off of the living, too. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a trap. "We have to destroy the stone," Friedrich shouted, his voice piercing the chaos. "But how?" Wilhelm cried out, slamming his rifle into a zombie's head. "It's alive, it's feeding on us." Friedrich's eyes narrowed. "We take away the source of its power. The man, the stone, it's all linked. We have to sever that link." The puppet master raised his hand again, his smile widening as he sensed their realization. "You think you can stop me?" His voice dripped with mockery. "You are already lost." The chamber seemed to hum in response to his words, the energy pulsing violently, the very ground beneath them shaking. The undead pressed closer, the air crackling with dark energy. But Friedrich, with a sudden, brutal clarity, knew what he had to do. He couldn't just fight the zombies. He had to destroy the link between them and the puppet master. "Wilhelm," he shouted, snapping his gaze to the sergeant. "The stone. We need to destroy it. Use explosives if you have to. We don't have time for anything else." Wilhelm nodded, his face grim, and without another word, he pulled a pack of grenades from his belt and handed them out to the men. "Cover me," he shouted, and with that, he dashed toward the platform. But as he moved, the undead surged once again, faster than before, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Friedrich's heart raced as he fired into the mass, trying to buy Wilhelm time, but it felt like fighting against the tide. Then, with a scream that echoed through the chamber, Wilhelm dove toward the platform, hurling the first grenade with all his strength. The moment it left his hand, he was tackled by a Russian zombie, its teeth snapping just inches from his throat. "No!" Friedrich screamed, rushing forward. But it was too late. The grenade exploded, sending a shockwave through the room. The force of the blast sent them all flying backward, the stone cracking violently as the blast hit its center. The entire chamber shuddered, and for a moment, the world went black. When Friedrich opened his eyes, he saw nothing but chaos. The explosion had torn the chamber apart. The undead were still around him, but now their movements were slow, stumbling, like puppets whose strings had been cut. The puppet master was gone, his power severed. And in the center of the room, the stone was nothing but a pile of shattered fragments. Friedrich gasped for air, his heart racing. They had done it. The curse, the plague, it was over. The undead no longer moved in unison. Their once malevolent energy had dissipated, leaving nothing but the husks of the dead. But at what cost? Wilhelm lay sprawled on the ground, his face pale, his body battered. The others were alive, barely, but they had won. They had severed the link, destroyed the source of the evil. But it had come at a cost. And now, the world would have to rebuild. Friedrich slowly got to his feet, his body aching from the explosion. He stood alone in the wreckage of the chamber, his rifle hanging loosely at his side, staring at the shattered stone. The ordeal was over. But the real battle, rebuilding their world and finishing the war, had just begun.